So the first thing I'm going to go over is the completeness pattern. And the completeness pattern is used when you are trying to highlight strengths or weaknesses in a plan or a diagram or organization. And what you're doing is you are coming to the table with the complete picture, and you're mapping, your customer's process or their company or something to the picture, and you're using that mapping to determine how strong or how weak or how close they are to the desired result. And this actually has some historical basis. So this is otherwise known in the scientific world. This is known as survivor's bias, because this technique was first used in World War II when planes were coming home, and they were trying to figure out how to, some planes didn't come back, and so they were trying to figure out how to armor these planes. And the suggestion was that, well, they come back with all these bullet holes here and here and here. We should put armor over here. And the gentleman who worked on this project was very smart. He realized that if these planes are coming back, that means that the ones that are not coming back are probably getting shot where there are no bullet holes. And so he collects this information over time, and he determines where there are no holes. This is just sort of a rough sketch. And then he's like, okay, this is where the planes are weak. And so this is where we will strengthen those planes. And so because he had the full picture in front of him, the plane, and because he had all the data, he was then able to mark on the map essentially what they were looking for. And so this is the same pattern that I used frequently at OutSystems, and I'm going to show you how I evolved that pattern. Now, when you're talking about a low-code platform like OutSystems, there's there's a lot of ways that it speeds up the development process. And in the end, the idea of low-code is to produce an application that is, faster to build, but also better, higher quality, more secure, because the platform is doing most of the work. And when you go to a product owner and you explain how they can use this to build applications to speed up their team, it's not already obvious, how this will be valuable to them. They're going to invest time and energy training people or possibly hiring new people. And product owners spend a significant amount of time cataloging developer skill sets and mapping them to the sprints they have to do, because developers are highly specialized. So the biggest challenge in a product owner for building an application is going to be juggling the skill sets of their team and trying to figure out who should go on which project, which sprint, where, what, when, depending on what part of the application has to be built. And this changes depending on what kind of application. Some applications are web, some are both web and have mobile components, things like that. So when I came to OutSystems, the first thing that was really important to do was try to get a sense of what all those, where the product owner was looking for people and skill sets, like where they'd have to staff up to do any kind of application. And so if you talk to these product owners, a lot of times they would tell you about the applications they struggled to make. And the applications they struggled to make would be things that were out of the skill sets of their current team. So in order to figure out, to prove to them that the platform had the capabilities that they were looking for, and that anyone on their team could actually use those capabilities. This was not something I would do live in front of a customer like some of these other patterns. You couldn't get this information in an hour. I'm just going to say that right away. This is like the plane. This is like the World War II situation. So I would get this information over time, probably over a series of conversations or a series of meetings with their team or their product owner. And so what I did is I worked on coming up with what was a universal application kind of pattern. Like if you were to build any application, what were the universal parts of it? And the most complete form kind of looks like this, where, an application, if it has a web and a mobile footprint, you would need to have a web developer and a front-end developer for web, and then another mobile developer for Android and another mobile developer for iOS. Even if you had those things, you probably still had a designer, or you had someone working on design in general, as well as, other, maybe specializations in HTML, CSS, or other kinds of things for the mobile platform, or maybe other frameworks. You would definitely have someone handling single sign-on or authentication, because usually the user base would already exist, or they'd want to do federated logins, or, social, or they'd want to connect to their existing single sign-on. So that was definitely a key. piece. And then you would have the logic and processes that would power the application itself, usually created by back-end developers or people who would be API developers if you're doing a microservice architecture. And then you have these integrations, and that would also require an engineer to know about the API or the technology being used. So they would still have to know here about like the telecommunications API and how it worked, and have domain knowledge there. And then it would always work with data, and there'd always be like relational data and unstructured data, which would be like pictures, binary, key value pairs, anything like that. And you could have other stuff in there, but usually they would slot into one of these categories. So this was a pretty good picture of like, if you're building an application, this is sort of what it looks like. And so when you're staffing up, what I would do is I would go talk to the product owner and their people, and I would ask them, just conversationally, like, what are you working on? What have you built? What is your domain knowledge? Like, what do you do normally? What are you trained in? And then they would just tell me over time. And what I would do is I would map it to these areas. And I would ask them too, like if they thought they were like an expert, if they'd done it long or not, because someone who's done it a long time is going to be a little more experienced than someone who just started working on something. And this is not entirely scientific, but what I would do is I would take each engineer on the product owner's team and I would color code them. And then I would draw over this diagram, like how much coverage or how much domain experience they really had in the creation of applications, and if they had full coverage. And in this case, this would reveal gaps, right? In this case, this particular company I drew this for did not have any native mobile developers. And so they outsourced the creation of their applications, or they struggled with them, or they didn't produce them. And this was a big gap because once you outsource an application, to change it, you have to go to the same company. Basically, once you outsource it and it comes back, the code base is really hard for someone to work on someone's code base. So it usually goes back to that outsourcer, or that's it. You're done. It's very static. In this case, it would be a very common thing for someone who was a web developer or a front-end web developer to only work on that technology. And then you'd have other people on the team that would know certain pieces and would be good in some areas and not good in other ones. And then some people who would know, like, a lot of these. And I was very generous with a lot of these because you don't want to question someone's domain knowledge. And then I would also ask about the key integrations, because that also required domain knowledge, and map out who knew those things. And as you can see here, like there's quite a lot of blue, like Keith is covering the team here. And then there's quite a lot of dependence on like the front end only being done by one person. And every time, if they were to build this application, it would take many weeks and months, because each sprint you'd have to assign a different engineer to work on a different piece, and they would be working on that piece and not on any other applications. And in OutSystems, now what I would do is we'd make a prediction, how, like, we would say, okay, any of these developers can actually learn the platform, and we would spend time with them, and they would have some exposure and say, this is great. And then the next thing we'd do is we'd take this information and we'd recalculate the timelines based on the fact that now, like, only one of those particular engineers, instead of being specialized to that, they could do the whole thing. And they didn't have to be a domain expert in here, because OutSystems have those integrations for them. So that would also be calculated. And then that would allow us to also redraw visually the timeline. So if you were working on an application, and they had a new timeline, then you would shrink each timeline by about 5 to 6 times. And then, because only one developer was needed, and it would also free them up for the sprint planning and be more effective in that planning. And then thus you could actually redraw those timelines. So this is a kind of visual presentation that we used. We took that data and we actually overlaid it visually, and we would use it in our kind of like later stage of the sale, when we were going to the product owner and saying, this is how effective you're going to be if you adopt this platform for these planned applications. And it was just very effective in showing them, where their complications would remain, and how much more progress they could take. So the key to this one, obviously, if we go back to where this starts, is understanding the full and complete pattern, and then taking your customer's information and laying it on top, and that would show those weaknesses. And that's really the key. If you are doing that kind of pattern, then that's what you have to bring to the table every time, is that complete picture, and then you can then show them where they're strong and weak.